another episode of Data Detective, and today we're going to talk about prompting with AI. I'll walk through some demos of our Lumos feature, but primarily this episode is meant to kind of help you figure out how to write great prompts, because that is how you interact with artificial intelligence these days. It's pretty remarkable what things can do, but you have to make sure that you're asking the right question in the right way. So let's start really simple, basic stuff. Apologies if I'm repeating anything that you already know, but let's you know what they say about assuming. So let's start with just simply, what is a prompt? And it's the message, it's the question, it's the instructions that you give the AI, and it's how you communicate with it. Now, this example in this particular episode, we're going to focus most specifically on asking about analytics and data intelligence for behavioral, like product analytics use cases, but I think thinking in terms of these kinds of structures is just going to help you make better use of whatever AI platform or tooling that you want to explore. And so it's like a super smart assistant, and you got to give it the good instructions, the thoughtful instructions, so that it can perform at its best. Because how it responds to you is only going to be as good as the question you ask it. And so analogy I like to use is, imagine you're asking a friend if they want to go see a movie. How can they say yes to that? If you just call somebody up, say, hey, you want to go see a movie? Well, they need to know more. Which movie are we seeing? I'm really not interested in seeing the newest, latest, greatest Marvel movie. I'm sick of them. I want to see something else. What theater are we going to? What time? And, when, what day of the week? Before I can really give you my answer. And so that context is really necessary to get the proper response and to enjoy the show with your friend. The same applies when getting instructions to AI agents, like Lumos in this case. So being specific about all that different context is just going to serve you best when you get that response. And so I kind of have this structure that I like to teach and tell people specifically about these kinds of questions around metrics and analytics, etc. And it kind of breaks down to this. I want to see a metric for some segments of users, for a specific kind of session, for events, but only looking at some limit. Do you only want to see it for new users, for a particular kind of content, and then for what time period? If that matters to your analysis and you only want to see things for the last month, last week, you need to be specific. And so taking this kind of structure, you can start to ask questions like, I want to see total number of purchases for active users, but only looking at US for the last month. And this is a really good prompt. And if you're looking at an LLM that's trained specifically on analyzing data, it's going to do a pretty good job of pulling back the proper query or creating the proper report. So let's jump into Kubit and kind of see all of this in action, because we can start with I would say, an objectively bad prompt. And this data set here is just our sample streaming data set. Think of like a Netflix or a Hulu kind of service. And the question I have is, what is our top performing content? Now, this is a really bad prompt for a couple reasons. Number one, I'm not articulating my metric. I say top performing, but the LLM doesn't probably understand what that means. So I would recommend staying away from superlatives like best, popular, trending, and give it a better articulation of what does that mean to the business. Because when I say top performing content, the LLM is going to build this report, but all it's going to do is count the number of stream completed events, which is a fair guess. I want to understand top performing. Simply doing the action the most would certainly necessitate a top performing piece of content. So as it populates this builder, you can see that it says count events, stream completed, and then it does a group by or breakdown by show title, which is great because I said, what is my top performing content? So it was smart enough to know that it needed to add that breakdown. But this is wrong because our business doesn't measure success of a piece of content by simply somebody streaming it. We want to know something like watch time in minutes. In fact, the LLM actually recommends that as saying, hey, consider using the watch time in minutes field with a sum function to rank content by total watch time. That's perfect. That's exactly what I want to do. And if I had been better in my question, I probably could have gotten there. So let's adjust our prompt and kind of follow the guidelines of adding the metric in so that I get a better response. And so our Lumos returned a new report. It augmented and updated what I had originally. Same event, but now we're looking at the field watch time in minutes summed, and we're keeping our show title breakdown. So in the builder, we can see that this metric has been created, and then the breakdown is staying consistent. So this is really great because if you are a novice business user that maybe doesn't understand the fundamentals of when should I sum something, what's the difference between counting and summing, etc., this particular model is trained to understand what all that means, and there's further prompting going on under the hood to give it context about metrics and how to measure and manage things, what data it should look at, how it should read the descriptions and fields, etc. So whenever you're evaluating or at least trying to implement AI, don't just look at, is it easy to use, but also make sure that under the hood are the proper instructions and context being added. Because even though I just sent this single question, when I send this question to the AI, there's actually about 4 or 5 other prompts that get sent to it to help it evaluate and figure out what's the right direction here and how should I build this report. So let's make this prompt even better, building on some of that structure that I mentioned before. And instead of just simply asking the highest total minutes watched, I'm adding over the last 2 weeks. So now I'm adding my date element to this to give it even more direction on what I want to see. Because Kubit, sure, other tools do the same, they're going to default to some time period. So my report was updated, same metric, but now it says the last 14 days. So I can keep iterating on this until I get exactly what I want. But once I'm happy with it, I can execute my report. In Kubit particularly, we're running SQL against the Cloud Data Warehouse. So we want to kind of make sure you can prompt it to get to what you think is the right answer before you execute the query. But it's up to you how you would want to manage that. But if I turn off the overall, maybe retool this a little bit, look at a line chart, I can see that the red list has been consistently the most popular. Josh Ryan is kind of ebbed and flowed, etc. So now I've got my report. I can continue my analytics. I can even explain these insights with more AI. So AI everywhere, everything, all at once. So let's think about maybe a more complicated use case. So that actually might require a user to even know which report type they want to build, which sometimes can even be a leap. If I'm brand new to data and analytics, I may not fundamentally understand the difference between like a path and a funnel and when I should use one versus the other. Now, there's training and resources, and I can go look at my docs, etc. But what's super cool about what we're building, and I imagine quite a few others are building as well, is kind of this like all-in-one chat interface where I can go in and ask questions without even necessarily knowing what report type I care about. So thinking about this prompt, I want to know what the percentage of new users who watched comedy last month, and has it changed month over month? So this is maybe a fairly complex question. At its surface, it might look pretty simple, but we're actually asking it to do quite a bit. The percentage is going to require a numerator and a denominator. I'm specifying new users, which may or may not have a clear identifier in the data set. Watched comedy is pretty straightforward, and then I want to see it last month, but then I also want to know, has it changed month over month? So let's send that into our chat interface, and now I don't even have to pick, is it a query, is it a this or that? The LLM is actually going to do that determining for me and decide what's the best way to present this information. And so when I get my response back, we get it in a bit more of like a chat interface where it's going to give me the AI's response of, I think that the percentage of new users, which is users whose install days is less than 7, who watched comedy last month, and then it's going to provide a month over month comparison. So if I click here, I can see the results, which is effectively going to run that query for me. I feel confident that it's going to do it correctly, but we'll see. So here's the results I get. I can make this a bar chart, make it a little bit easier to see. And I can see that roughly 60% of my new users watched comedy in May, and 77% watched it in June. I can continue iterating and tweaking this, adding breakdowns, etc., or just simply add it to a dashboard. Now I can also ask different kinds of reports type questions. So maybe now I want to move into like a conversion exploration of how long does it take a user to convert from trial to paid subscription. Now this is a great prompt because my metric is the how long does it take, and then I have my subject here of user, and then my kind of additional like metric but also qualifiers of converting from trial to paid subscription. This is going to ultimately be a funnel, but I didn't have to know that. I didn't have to go find a funnel report and build it there. As long as my prompt is kind of mentioning things like conversion and conversion rates, etc. Usually the LLMs are going to be pretty smart to know, oh, this is the kind of report that you need. So you can see, got a step 1 of trial started, step 2, purchase subscription, and the report mode is going to be set to time to convert. So that's perfect. I can execute my report, continue my analysis investigation, see that it takes roughly 2 hours at the median, and on average about 2 hours and 27 minutes. So pretty cool stuff here. Going back to our prompting best practices, just make sure you're very specific and clear. So instead of asking questions like what is our traffic, try something like how many active users do we have? So qualifying the people or the objects that you care about. Including the time and filter context in your prompt is going to be really important, because how else would it know? You know, if you're talking to an analyst, they're going to have the same questions back to you. Hey, do you want to see how far back do you want me to go for this? Do you only want me to pull the US audience or the entire world? You know, be specific. Invest in the data model definitions. You know, I mentioned before that the LLMs are likely going to understand much better when you've got column descriptions and event descriptions, and your naming conventions might be a little wacky, but at least you've got some context for it to understand. So adding and investing time in those things is going to really pay dividends. Iterating with the follow-ups, you know, making sure that you feel comfortable going that next step. Hey, I asked this question, but now I want to see it broken down by country, or I want to see it for only users that did a certain action at a certain point in time. Creating cohorts with natural language is like another iteration and version of this, where you can say, you know, give me users who purchased at least 4 times last month and also is subscribed to our newsletter. That can be a pretty complex query, but LLMs are going to be smart enough, ideally, to understand, you know, what that means. So hopefully this was useful, valuable information, at least on this very narrow topic of AI prompting. Let me know how it fares for you, and if you have any follow-ups or other questions, and I'm happy to answer those. But in the meantime, happy prompting, everybody. Thank you. Creating